Hi, it's Dave, and I wanted to start off this video series talking about a few terms that we use in a real estate transaction. The first one is under contract, and when a buyer and a seller come to an agreement on purchase price and other factors in buying a home, once everyone has signed, then we are under contract. At that point, we open escrow, and what escrow is, it's a third party who's neutral to the transaction. So we have an escrow officer who will take care of prorating taxes, taking care of the earnest money deposit, and a host of other things that go on during a transaction. Speaking of earnest money, that basically gives the buyer skin in the game. There is no set amount for earnest money. Typically, it's about 1%, maybe rounded down a little bit. So if it's a $500,000 house, a typical earnest money would be $5,000. And then the last term I wanted to talk about is, it actually has probably three different terms: closing, close of escrow, or recording. All those mean the same thing, and that is the moment that the county records the transaction. That's when it becomes the buyer's house and the seller no longer owns it. So yeah, I hope you enjoyed this series, and hopefully it'll be helpful. So the first part of the transaction we'll talk about is the contract. That's obviously the biggie. If you're a buyer that I'm representing, I'll set up a search on the MLS. We'll go around, we'll look at houses. Once you find something you want to put an offer in on, I'll write up the paperwork for that. There's a lot of paperwork, but I'll help you through that. We will come to terms as far as the purchase price. Typically, the seller will provide a 1-year home warranty to the buyer, with the seller paying for that. We'll figure out the earnest money deposit amount. If you saw my opening video, there is no set amount, but it's kind of typically 1%, sometimes rounded down a little bit. When I submit that to the other agent, they will present it to the seller. There are times where it's a multiple offer situation, and that's always a lot of fun, but that's where I can really come in and help you know what to do and how to get your offer accepted. I've gotten a lot of offers accepted even when they were not the highest offer, believe it or not. There are times when the seller will do a counter offer. I think there's a misconception that virtually every offer will receive a counter offer, and that is simply not the case. The majority of offers are accepted as is, but a lot of times there will be a counter offer. Sometimes it's just for a technicality, like close of escrow date, or just clear up any technicality like that. This video will talk about once you get an offer accepted. So if you're on the buyer's side, I will open escrow. And if you don't know what escrow is, check out the very first video where I talk about some terminology. I'll make arrangements to have the earnest money deposit picked up by the escrow company. And I can also order the home inspection. If you have someone in mind, that's great. But otherwise, I have a great home inspection company I can recommend. In the next video, we'll talk about the home inspection. So for the home inspection, you don't actually need to be there while the inspector is going about his work. Inspections typically take 2 to 3 hours, depending on the size of the home, if there's a pool, the age of the home, that sort of thing. The pricing also depends on those factors, so there is no set price for the home inspection. Then the inspection company will give us a time to meet with the home inspector. I'm always there to meet with you, and I know some questions to ask, and I know some things to kind of point out as we go along. Just so you know, whether you're on the buyer side or the seller side, the home inspector is going to come up with a ton of things that are quote unquote wrong with the house. Many of them most people don't care about, but some of them are important. The biggest two expenses potentially are roof and air conditioning, other than if you have a foundation issue. That could be very major, but those are fortunately uncommon as far as having a real problem with foundations. So after we meet with the inspector, we will talk and we'll figure out what repairs the buyer wants to ask for. And if I have you on the seller side, we just wait for that form to come in, and our next video is going to talk about that form. After the home inspection, I'll help the buyer figure out what they want to ask for in the way of repairs. You want to make sure you don't ask for too much, or the seller will just throw their hands up and say, forget it. You want to ask for things that are important to you and that are reasonable. A lot of things you can fix yourself if you're even halfway handy, and if you're very handy, you might be able to do a little bit more work. The form we use for that is commonly referred to as the BINSR, which stands for Buyer Inspection Notice and Seller's Response. And on that form, there are a lot of blank lines because it's possible that there'll be a whole lot of items asked for. I always tell my sellers, don't worry about the length of the list, just look at how much it's going to cost, because you could have 20 items that don't cost nearly as much as one item, like if it's to replace the roof or replace the air conditioning. So just keep that in mind, whether you're the buyer or the seller. The number of items isn't important, it's the cost of the items that really counts. After the BINSR is submitted to the listing agent, then the listing agent talks to the seller and determines A, are you willing to do all the repairs? B, are you not going to do any of the repairs, which is very uncommon, by the way? Or C, which is the most common, are you going to do some repairs and not all of them? And typically it's going to be most of those repairs and not all of them. So yeah, in most situations, the seller agrees to either do all the repairs or else the majority of them. But they don't have to. And I always tell my sellers, these are not demands, these are requests. And you can take them or leave them. If you decide not to, then the BINSR goes back to the buyer, and the buyer decides to either accept the terms that the seller has provided or cancel the offer. And those are, at this point, the only two options available. So that's where a lot of times I'll work with the other agent and try and kind of pre-negotiate things before we get that final BINSR signature, because we don't want it to be canceled over something that maybe, yeah, the seller is willing to do after all. So after that comes the appraisal, and that's our next video up. For the appraisal, I always wait until we get through the BINSR coming to an agreement on the repairs. As a real estate agent, I think one of my strongest points is being able to figure the value of a home. So if I have you as a buyer, if we've put in the offer, we already know that it's going to be pretty close to the appraised value. So whether I have you as buyer or seller, I'll look at comps, make adjustments for condition, whether it's got a pool, that sort of thing, come up with an estimated value and do it in the way that an appraiser does it. And so if I've got you as the seller, I will meet the appraiser and present comps to them, comparable properties that have made adjustments, and I'll give a list of upgrades that you've done. That is very helpful for the appraisal as well. So if the appraisal comes in at full value, great, we're all set. If it comes in low, then one of three things happens. Either the seller comes down in price, the buyer pays the extra in addition to the loan, so it'd be extra at closing, or they can meet somewhere in between. Once we get through the appraisal process, then there's not a lot to do other than waiting for the loan to finish processing, assuming there is a loan. And then we will get to the end of the transaction where there's a little flurry of activity, and that's what we'll talk about in the next video. Well, we've rounded the final turn and we're heading for home for the final stages of this real estate transaction. 3 days before close of escrow, any repairs need to be done by the seller, and they will present receipts for that. You will sign final documents. The only thing you cannot do by e-signatures is signing the final documents. If you're out of state or out of the country at the time, it's not a problem. The escrow officer will set up a mobile notary, and they can take care of that in your home or at work or wherever you're at, on vacation, wherever. One thing that's often confusing is that when you sign the final documents, that is not when we close. You will always sign before we close. Typically, it's at least a day ahead of time. A lot of times the seller can sign maybe a week or even more ahead of time. And then after that, we will get the closing. So when we close, that's the moment that the county records the transaction, and we will not know what time of day that's going to be. We just have to wait for that call. So the escrow officer will call me, let me know, and at that point I call you with the good news, and that's always the best part of the entire transaction. There are a few other little details to take care of right before that. If you're a seller, leaving keys in a drawer, garage remotes, letting the buyer know which mailbox number it is and where it's located if it's not on your property, and a few little odds and ends like that. You want to switch utilities. If you're the seller, you want to stop them, obviously. If you're the buyer, you want to get them started on the day of closing, and you want to do the same thing with your insurance. So at that point, everybody's happy, and you either just sold a house or you just bought a new one to move into. So congratulations.